Hey everyone! Welcome to HOA Karen Expose. Today's story is all about an out-of-control HOA Karen. Subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe for more wild stories like this. Speech balloon comment. Ever dealt with a Karen or a crazy HOA? Drop your story in the comments. You ever hear a story so ridiculous, so petty, that it just makes you shake your head? That's exactly what happened to me a few months ago. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't trying to pick a fight. I was just trying to add a little charm to my front yard. But apparently, a certain someone in my neighborhood thought a small garden gnome was a direct attack on the fabric of our community. Let me back up a little. I live in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. You know the kind: clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, people who wave at you when you drive by, even if they don't actually know your name. It's peaceful, safe, kinda boring if I'm being honest, but it's home. And for the most part, the people here are nice. They keep to themselves, respect your space, and just want to live their lives. Now, this neighborhood has an HOA, a homeowners association. If you've never dealt with one, count yourself lucky. These folks have rules for everything. What color your house can be painted, how tall your grass should be, even what kind of mailbox you can have. It's all in this big rule book they gave us when we moved in. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured, okay, rules are rules. As long as they don't bother me, I won't bother them. But here's the thing. There's always that one person in the HOA who takes their role way too seriously. You know the type. They treat the HOA like it's the FBI. They patrol the streets like they're on some kind of neighborhood watch mission. They memorize the rulebook better than their own family's birthdays. In our neighborhood, that person is a woman named Karen. And let me tell you, she lives up to every part of that stereotype. Karen is the president of our HOA. She's the one who sends out monthly emails reminding everyone to pressure wash their driveways and remove unsightly decorations. She's the one who writes strongly worded letters if your trash can stays on the curb a few hours too long. And she's the one who decided that my innocent little garden gnome was some kind of threat to the community's image. I remember the day it happened. It was a Saturday morning. I had just finished mowing the lawn and decided to place this cute little gnome near my flower bed. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't creepy or weird. Just a cheerful little guy holding a watering can with a big smile on his face. I thought it added a nice touch. My yard looked better with it. Friends who saw it said it gave my place some personality. But apparently Karen didn't agree. 3 days later, I get this letter in the mail from the HOA. It wasn't even a warning. It was a formal notice of violation. According to the letter, I had broken Rule 14.6 of the HOA guidelines. No unauthorized lawn ornaments are permitted in visible areas of the property. And get this, attached to the letter was a $500 fine. $500. For a gnome. At first I laughed. I mean, it had to be a joke, right? Who finds someone $500 for a garden decoration that's barely a foot tall? But nope, there it was, black and white, complete with Karen's signature at the bottom. And the cherry on top? A photo of my gnome, like it was some kind of criminal caught in the act. I honestly didn't know whether to be angry or amused. The more I thought about it, though, the more it got under my skin. I didn't put a broken-down car on my front lawn. I didn't hang up flashing neon lights. It was just a gnome. A peaceful, plastic gnome doing absolutely nothing wrong. And yet, here I was, fined, threatened with further action, and told I had 7 days to comply or risk additional penalties. So I did what any rational person would do. I started digging. I pulled out the HOA rulebook, yes, the same thick packet I ignored when we moved in. I read through every line, every paragraph, looking for this mysterious Rule 14.6. And there it was. But the wording was interesting. It didn't actually ban all lawn ornaments. It said, unauthorized ornaments. But there was no section explaining what was authorized and what wasn't. No list of approved items. No guidelines for size, color, material, nothing. It was vague, ambiguous, open to interpretation. Which got me thinking, if the rule doesn't define what counts as unauthorized, then how can they enforce it? And more importantly, who decides what's authorized and what's not? I had a feeling I already knew the answer to that one.
Karen.
Of course. It had to be her. She probably made the call herself, thinking no one would question her. Most people wouldn't, honestly. Most people would just remove the gnome, grumble a bit, and move on. But not me. Not this time. I'm not the kind of person who likes drama. I don't go looking for fights. But I also don't like being pushed around, especially over something so ridiculous. So I decided that if Karen wanted to play by the rulebook, I'd play too, only smarter. Now, this wasn't about the money. Sure, $500 is a lot, and I wasn't about to just hand it over for nothing. But it was bigger than that. It was about principle, about standing up to someone who was clearly abusing her little bit of power, about showing her that rules work both ways. So, while Karen thought she had won, I was already working on a way to turn her own game against her. And it all started with that one smiling gnome. When I first read the letter from the HOA, I was mostly confused. I mean, $500? For a garden gnome? That's not just a small penalty, it's outrageous. So, I sat down with the rulebook, determined to figure out what was going on. I wanted to understand what exactly I had supposedly done wrong. The rulebook itself was a thick binder filled with every possible regulation you could imagine. It covered everything from the height of your grass to the color your curtains could be if they faced the street. Honestly, it felt like a set of instructions for a dollhouse rather than a real neighborhood. I flipped to the section Karen's letter cited, Rule 14.6. It was a single sentence buried halfway down a page, saying, "No unauthorized lawn ornaments shall be permitted in visible areas of the property." That was it. No explanation of what unauthorized meant. No list of approved or banned ornaments. No pictures, no examples. Just a vague, open-ended rule. That was the first crack in their case. So, I looked elsewhere in the rulebook to find any other mentions of lawn decorations. I figured if they wanted to find me, the rules must be clear somewhere. But no luck. There were some rules about holiday decorations, saying you can only display them during certain times of the year. There was a rule about statues over 3 feet tall needing approval, but nothing specifically about gnomes or small garden statues. Then I turned to the HOA's process for fines and disputes. This section detailed how the board decides on fines, and it talked a lot about community standards and maintaining neighborhood aesthetics. But guess what? There was no mention of any process for homeowners to request clarification or appeal based on rule ambiguity. It felt like the HOA was basically saying, "We can fine you for anything we feel like, and you have to pay up." That's when I started thinking about how subjective and unfair this all was. I wasn't the first person to have issues with Karen. A few neighbors had quietly complained to me over time about her heavy-handed approach. One lady told me she got a warning for having a hanging flower pot that was too colorful. Another guy had to repaint his fence twice because Karen didn't like the shade he chose, even though it was within the approved color palette. And yet, some neighbors seemed to get a free pass. Karen's own house had dozens of decorations in the front yard. Big statues, flashy lighting, you name it. It was like 2 different sets of rules existed. One for Karen and her friends, and one for the rest of us. The more I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just about a garden gnome. It was about power and control. So, I decided to document everything. I started taking pictures of my gnome, the letter, the rulebook sections, and the neighborhood. I wanted to make sure I had a solid record of what was happening. That's when an idea started to form in my head. If Karen wanted to use the rulebook against me, maybe I could use it against her. If the rules were vague and inconsistently enforced, maybe I could find loopholes or exceptions that worked in my favor. I went back through the HOA documents with fresh eyes, looking for anything that could help me. And I found a few interesting things. For starters, there was a clause about decorations that enhance the community's appearance. It was buried deep in the aesthetic guidelines but seemed to imply some ornaments were actually encouraged if they met certain standards. It didn't say what those standards were, exactly, but it was enough to question Karen's claim that my gnome was automatically unauthorized. Then, there was a section about temporary decorations that could be placed for events or seasonal celebrations. This was important because it showed the HOA acknowledged some decorations were okay at certain times. And finally, a rule about homeowner rights to reasonable enjoyment of property. It stated that the HOA couldn't impose rules that were unreasonable or discriminatory. That sounded promising. With all this in mind, I started planning how to respond. I knew outright ignoring the fine wasn't a great idea. That would just escalate things. But I also didn't want to just remove the gnome and pay the fine like a scared kid being bullied. I wanted to make sure Karen and the HOA understood this wasn't okay. My first step was to write a letter back to the HOA. I wanted to keep it professional but firm. I laid out my points. The rule cited was vague and didn't clearly ban my garden gnome. The HOA rulebook lacked specific guidelines on lawn ornaments. There were inconsistencies in enforcement, with some neighbors, including Karen, having similar or more elaborate decorations. The fine amount was excessive and not proportional to the alleged violation. I also asked for a formal explanation of what unauthorized meant and for the HOA to provide a list of prohibited items or clear criteria. I sent the letter certified so I had proof they received it. While waiting for a response, I didn't just sit idle. I reached out to a couple of neighbors who had faced similar issues. They shared stories of their own battles with Karen and the HOA, which gave me more confidence that this wasn't just my personal fight, it was a broader problem. Together, we discussed ways to challenge the HOA's overreach. Some neighbors were scared to speak up, fearing retaliation, but a few were willing to quietly support me. Then came the HOA's reply. Predictably, it was a generic letter defending the rule and stating the fine would stand unless I removed the gnome within 7 days. No clarifications, no list, no concessions. That's when I realized Karen wasn't interested in fairness or discussion. She just wanted to flex her power. So I had to think bigger. If the HOA rulebook was their weapon, I would turn it into my shield and sword. The idea was simple but risky. I would find every loophole I could, exploit every ambiguity, and hold the HOA accountable for their own rules. For example, if the rule said no unauthorized lawn ornaments but didn't define unauthorized, I could argue my gnome was authorized by default because no rule prohibited it clearly. If the HOA said it wanted to maintain community aesthetics, I could show my gnome was tasteful and added charm, thus enhancing the appearance. If they tried to fine me for future decorations, I would demand clear, written guidelines. And if they tried to punish me unfairly, I would highlight their selective enforcement, including Karen's own yard. I also researched local laws about HOA powers and homeowners' rights. In many places, HOAs can enforce rules that are arbitrary or discriminatory. They have to follow fair processes. That gave me more ammo. Then came the fun part, putting a plan into action. I started by making a few changes to the gnome. Nothing major, just small tweaks so it looked a little more like a seasonal decoration. I added a tiny Santa hat, it was almost Christmas, some fake snow around the base, and a small string of battery-operated lights. This was important because the rulebook said temporary decorations were allowed during holidays. I sent another letter to the HOA, explaining that I had modified the gnome to comply with the temporary decoration rule and asked for confirmation that it was now authorized. Of course, Karen's response was predictably negative. She claimed the modifications didn't matter and the fine still stood. But I didn't stop there. I took photos of other yards in the neighborhood, including Karen's, showing all kinds of decorations that were technically against the rules but never fined. I compiled the photos into a document and sent a formal complaint to the HOA board, asking for an investigation into selective enforcement and fairness. This put Karen and the HOA on the defensive. Suddenly, they were the ones needing to explain themselves. Meanwhile, I made sure to keep everything polite but firm. I wasn't trying to create a war zone just to protect my rights and call out hypocrisy. At this point, a few more neighbors started reaching out to me privately. They were inspired by my fight and wanted to join forces. It was becoming clear this wasn't just a battle about a garden gnome anymore. It was about standing up to an unfair system that tried to bully people into submission. And all because of a little statue with a big smile. After I sent the complaint and pointed out the inconsistencies, things started to shift. At first, the HOA board seemed taken aback, probably not used to someone pushing back like this. I could almost imagine Karen fuming, clutching the rulebook like it was her Bible, realizing that I wasn't just going to quietly remove my gnome and move on. But I wasn't done yet. I kept documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every interaction. I even started recording some phone calls just to be safe. That way, if things escalated to a legal battle, I'd have evidence showing how unreasonable the HOA was being. I also began talking more openly with my neighbors. Some of them, quietly fed up with Karen's reign, were relieved someone was finally standing up. Others were still hesitant, worried about stirring up trouble. But slowly, a small group started to form. We shared stories about Karen's picky rules and how she seemed to pick favorites. It wasn't just about gnomes or decorations anymore. It was about fairness and respect. One neighbor told me about how Karen had fined her for having a bird feeder that was too tall. Another shared that Karen once sent a letter demanding a man repaint his garage door because the color clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic, even though the door was within the approved palette. The list went on and on. It was like a pattern of micromanagement and selective enforcement. I realized that Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was wielding her power like a weapon. And the HOA was backing her up. Then things took an interesting turn. The HOA board scheduled a meeting to discuss the complaints. I wasn't surprised. They probably wanted to address the growing discontent before it spread further. I made sure to attend. I wasn't going to miss my chance to speak up. At the meeting, the room was packed with homeowners, more than I'd ever seen before. People were nervous but hopeful. When my turn came, I calmly explained the situation with the gnome, the vague rulebook, and the selective enforcement. I showed photos of Karen's own yard and other neighbors' decorations that had never been fined. Some board members looked uncomfortable, but Karen was her usual confident self. She argued that rules were rules, that the gnome violated the aesthetic standards, and that the fines were necessary to keep the neighborhood looking nice. But I wasn't buying it. I pointed out the lack of clear definitions in the rules, the inconsistent enforcement, and the excessive fine amount. I reminded everyone that we were homeowners, not tenants. We had rights. Surprisingly, a few board members nodded quietly. I could tell that not everyone agreed with Karen's harsh approach. After the meeting, I talked with some of those members privately. They admitted they felt Karen had taken too much control, and they wanted to see the rules updated to be clearer and fairer. That gave me hope. Meanwhile, Karen's attitude hardened. She started sending more emails, this time threatening additional fines and even legal action if I didn't remove the gnome immediately. It was clear she wanted to intimidate me. But by then, I wasn't alone. More neighbors were standing with me, quietly pushing back. Some began to quietly display small decorations, testing the limits of the rules. Others started asking for written clarifications on what was allowed. The HOA was suddenly under pressure to act more transparently. I kept sending polite but firm letters, asking for rule clarifications and expressing concerns about selective enforcement. I also asked for the HOA to provide a formal process for appealing fines, since the current system was vague and one-sided. The HOA board eventually agreed to form a committee to review the rules. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Then, one day, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney. It was threatening a lawsuit if I didn't pay the original fine within 10 days. It was intimidating, but I was prepared. I forwarded the letter to a local lawyer I'd consulted, who specialized in HOA disputes. She told me that many HOAs overreach and try to bully homeowners into submission, but that there were protections under state law. We started preparing a response. At the same time, I made a bold move. I invited the HOA board to come see my yard in person. I wanted them to see that my gnome was harmless, even charming. I wanted them to see the community spirit, not just their rulebook. They came one afternoon led by Karen. She barely hid her scowl. As they walked around, I explained the modifications I'd made to the gnome to comply with temporary decoration rules. I showed them photos comparing other yards. I asked questions about how they decided which decorations were allowed. Karen stammered, unable to give clear answers. By the end of the visit, a couple of board members admitted that the rules needed clearer guidelines and fairer enforcement. But Karen wasn't done. She doubled down on her threats, saying she'd escalate the matter to the entire HOA membership. That's when things got really interesting. I started gathering signatures from neighbors for a petition to reform the HOA rules and change the leadership. I didn't want to start a war, but I also wanted change. The petition quickly gained support. Karen and her allies weren't happy. They sent out letters warning neighbors about divisiveness and disrespecting the community. But their efforts only made more people question her leadership. Soon, the HOA called a special meeting to vote on rule changes and board leadership. I prepared my speech carefully. I wanted to be calm, factual, and persuasive. On the day of the vote, the room was packed again. Tension was thick. I stood up and spoke from the heart. I explained how vague rules and selective enforcement had hurt community trust. I shared my story about the garden gnome, the fine, and the fight for fairness. I asked for transparency, clear guidelines, and respect for homeowners' rights. The vote was close, but the motion to reform the rules passed. Karen lost her position as HOA president. It was a huge win. More importantly, it showed what happens when people stand up together. In the weeks that followed, the HOA released a new, clearer set of rules about decorations. They included specific guidelines about size, type, and allowed periods for seasonal ornaments. And my garden gnome? It stayed exactly where it was, smiling, holding that little watering can, a small symbol of resistance and community pride. After the big vote and the rule reforms, you'd think things would calm down, right? Well, that's what I hoped for anyway. But you know how these neighborhood dramas go. They don't just disappear overnight. In the weeks following Karen's ousting, there was definitely a shift in the air. People were talking more openly. The mood felt lighter. I'd get nods or smiles when I walked by, and even some neighbors who'd kept quiet before started showing little touches of personality in their yards, bright flower pots, colorful welcome signs, and yes, a few more garden gnomes. It was like the neighborhood was waking up from a long spell of strict silence. But change doesn't happen without some bumps. Karen didn't just fade away. She stuck around, acting like a wounded lion. She showed up at HOA meetings, still pushing back against the new rules, trying to regain her influence. Some of her supporters tried to keep the old ways alive, insisting the neighborhood needed order and standards. It felt like a small war between the old guard and the new. Still, the new board was determined to keep things fair. They introduced a new process for complaints and disputes, more transparent, with clear steps and opportunities for homeowners to appeal. They also promised regular updates to the rulebook with community input. For me, the victory was sweeter than just keeping the gnome. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that homeowners don't have to be powerless, that rules should be clear, fair, and applied equally. I got a lot of messages from neighbors thanking me for standing up. Some said they'd been scared to speak out before, worried about retaliation. Others shared stories of similar struggles with HOAs elsewhere. It became clear this wasn't just a local issue, it was a widespread problem in many communities. Meanwhile, I kept the gnome proudly displayed. I even added a few little accessories here and there, just to keep Karen on her toes. A tiny American flag during the 4th of July, a little scarf in winter. It became more than just a decoration, it was a symbol. The HOA, under new leadership, started focusing more on community-building activities, picnics, block parties, cleanup days. It felt like we were finally moving toward a real neighborhood, not just a collection of houses ruled by a strict rulebook. Of course, not everyone was happy. Some of the old-timers grumbled that things were getting too lax, that the new board was being soft. But honestly, the majority seemed relieved. For the first time in years, people felt like they had a voice. I even started thinking about running for a position on the board myself. If you told me a year ago I'd be interested in HOA politics, I would have laughed. But now I saw how important it was to have homeowners who actually cared about fairness and community. Through all this, I learned a few big lessons. First, never underestimate the power of knowing your rights. That rulebook looked scary at first, but once I took the time to read it carefully, I found the cracks. The vagueness, the inconsistencies, the lack of due process. Those were things I could challenge. Second, don't be afraid to speak up. It's easy to ignore small injustices and hope they go away. But sometimes standing up for something small like a garden gnome can lead to bigger changes. People notice. You inspire others. Third, community matters. I couldn't have done this alone. It was the support and stories from neighbors that gave me strength. When people come together, even small voices become loud. And lastly, sometimes a little humor helps. I mean, who would have thought a plastic gnome could shake up an entire HOA? But it did. And that's kind of beautiful. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't just roll over and pay that $500 fine. It wasn't just about money, it was about respect, about fairness, about saying no to bullying. So now, when I walk past my front yard, I don't just see a gnome. I see a small victory. A little guy who stood tall against a mountain of nonsense. And every time someone asks about the story, I smile and say, sometimes it's the smallest things that make the biggest difference. With the dust finally settling, I found myself thinking a lot about how neighborhoods like ours can turn into battlegrounds, all because of a few vague rules and a person who loves to enforce them. The HOA, when it's run well, is supposed to help maintain property values and keep things peaceful. But when power gets abused, it can do the opposite. It divides people, breeds resentment, and kills the sense of community. What surprised me most was how many people just accepted the situation as normal. Like, oh yeah, that's just how the HOA is. But it doesn't have to be that way. After the reforms, I noticed something else. People started talking to each other more, really talking beyond the usual hi over the fence. It was like the whole neighborhood got a little friendlier. Maybe because we'd been through a tough time together, or maybe because the air wasn't so thick with tension. One neighbor even started a little garden club, meeting every Saturday morning to share tips and plant flowers in front yards. Another started a monthly newsletter highlighting community events and neighborhood stories. It was a far cry from the silent, rule-obsessed place I'd moved into. And through all this, the gnome became a bit of a local legend. Kids started asking their parents about it, and some would sneak little hats or scarves onto it just for fun. It became a kind of mascot for standing up to unfairness, but also for light-hearted community spirit. Karen? Well, she still lives here, but she's not the HOA president anymore. I think she realized that the neighborhood had changed, and her old style of strict control wasn't going to work anymore. She kept to herself more after that, and I think even she might have softened a bit, at least enough to stop chasing people over garden decorations. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just taken down the gnome and paid the fine. Probably nothing. But I wouldn't have met so many neighbors. I wouldn't have learned so much about standing up for my rights. And I definitely wouldn't have gotten to be part of changing my community for the better. In the end, that little plastic statue was more than just a garden ornament. It was a symbol of resilience and community spirit. And that's a story I'm proud to share. So if you ever find yourself facing an unfair rule or a bully in your neighborhood, remember, sometimes it's the smallest things that can make the biggest difference. Stand your ground, find your people, and don't be afraid to turn the rulebook back on those who use it to try and control you. Because in the end, community is about more than rules. It's about respect, fairness, and standing together. After the big fight with the HOA and Karen, things settled into a new rhythm, but it wasn't just the gnome that stayed. The whole neighborhood started feeling different, more alive, more connected. You could tell people weren't just living side by side anymore. They were actually part of something together. One afternoon, I was chatting with Mrs. Ramirez, who lives 2 doors down. She told me how she'd been so scared of Karen's warnings that she barely decorated her yard for years. Now, with the new rules, she was planting bright flowers and even added a little ceramic bird bath. I feel like I can finally make my home look the way I want, she said, smiling. That meant a lot to me. Because this wasn't just about a silly statue, it was about freedom to enjoy your own space without fear. And the best part? The neighbors started looking out for each other more. When someone had a rough week, a few folks would drop off meals or check in. People swapped tools, shared garden tips, and even started a little neighborhood watch. Not the Snoopy kind, but the kind that made sure everyone felt safe and supported. It was a far cry from the tense, divided place I'd moved into. Instead of whispered complaints and secret frustrations, there was now open conversation and genuine care. One of the funniest moments came when a group of kids decided to throw a gnome parade down the block. They dressed up their own little garden statues in hats, scarves, and sunglasses. It was silly, joyful, and exactly the kind of thing that would have made Karen shake her head in disbelief. But it also showed how a small act of rebellion, one garden gnome, had sparked something much bigger. As for me, the experience changed how I saw my role in the community. I realized that sometimes standing up to unfairness means being a leader, even if you never wanted to be one. And that leaders don't have to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes they just need to be persistent, patient, and willing to listen. Over time, I started volunteering with the HOA board, helping make sure new rules were fair and easy to understand. I also helped organize community events that brought people together, building friendships that made this place feel more like home. Looking back, it's wild to think all this started with a $500 fine over a garden gnome. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes the smallest things shine a light on bigger problems. And sometimes that light is what's needed to bring people together. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember, you're not alone. And sometimes all it takes is one small act of standing up to change everything. Life after the big HOA showdown was, well, surprisingly refreshing. At first, I worried that things would stay tense or that Karen and her loyalists would keep trying to stir trouble. But what happened instead was something I didn't quite expect. The community began to heal. People started opening up in ways they hadn't for years. Suddenly, the fences that separated our yards felt less like barriers and more like gentle borders between neighbors who actually knew and cared about each other. It's funny how a small thing like a garden gnome could become a catalyst for all that. One morning, I was walking my dog when I ran into Mr. Thompson, the elderly gentleman who lived 3 houses down. We hadn't spoken much before. He was one of those quiet neighbors who kept to himself. But that day, he stopped me with a smile. "You know," he said, "I never liked all those strict rules either. They made the neighborhood feel like a prison. But I wasn't sure how to say anything. You did good standing up." That moment stuck with me. It wasn't about me being a hero or anything like that. It was about breaking a silence that had kept people isolated and scared of speaking up. Mr. Thompson's words felt like a gentle confirmation that the fight had meaning. As the weeks passed, more neighbors joined the conversations. People started to bring out their own stories about unfair fines, odd restrictions, and frustrations with the HOA's vague rules. What shocked me was how many people had simply accepted those conditions, thinking there was no way to change things. One afternoon, I helped organize a neighborhood potluck in the community park. It was the first big event in years. Kids ran around with painted faces, while adults swapped gardening tips and recipes. The atmosphere was warm and open, something our neighborhood hadn't seen in a long time. At that potluck, I met Jenna and Marcus, a young couple who had just moved in. They told me how relieved they were that the HOA was now more reasonable and how much they appreciated the new spirit of cooperation. "It feels like we're part of a real community now," Jenna said. "Not just people living in houses next to each other." Marcus nodded. "And it all started because of a little garden gnome? That's wild." I laughed and explained the full story. The gnome wasn't just a funny little statue anymore. It was a symbol of courage, of standing up for fairness, and of community unity. That night, walking home, I thought about how change works. It doesn't always come from big, dramatic gestures. Sometimes, it's the small, persistent acts that slowly turn the tide. In the months that followed, the HOA board, now led by a new group elected with community input, kept working to make things better. They held monthly meetings that were open and welcoming, with clear agendas and opportunities for homeowners to voice their opinions. They revised the rulebook extensively, making sure everything was spelled out in plain language. There were clear guidelines about decorations, landscaping, parking, and more. Importantly, there was now a fair appeals process for any disputes. The neighborhood started to feel like a place where fairness wasn't just a buzzword, but a real commitment. One of the best changes was how neighbors began to look out for each other. A group started a welcome committee to greet new residents, help them understand the rules, and introduce them to the community. That kind of support made moving in less stressful and more welcoming. I joined that group, happy to pass on what I'd learned. It felt good to help others avoid the struggles I'd faced. Karen, interestingly enough, stayed around but kept a much lower profile. I ran into her once or twice at meetings. She seemed quieter, less fiery, maybe even a bit reflective. I like to think the experience changed her too, in some way. One evening, at a community meeting, Karen spoke up, not to argue but to suggest a new idea for neighborhood landscaping. It was the first time she'd participated in a constructive way since the big conflict. It struck me how people can change when given the chance. Throughout all this, my garden gnome remained a fixture in my yard. Sometimes neighbors would ask about him, or kids would leave little gifts next to him: a painted rock, a tiny flag, a small bouquet of wildflowers. It became more than just a decoration. It was a reminder of how standing up can lead to change. Looking back, I realized this whole ordeal taught me a lot about community, resilience, and leadership. I learned that rules matter, but only if they're fair, clear, and applied equally. I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't mean being combative. It means being informed, respectful, and persistent. I learned that a community is strongest when its members listen to each other, support one another, and work together. And I learned that sometimes the smallest things, a garden gnome, a petition, a conversation, can spark the biggest changes. If there's one message I hope people take from this, it's that you don't have to accept unfairness or bullying in your community. You have a voice. You have power. And sometimes, that power starts with something as simple as saying no. So, whether you're dealing with a difficult HOA, a strict landlord, or just a tough neighbor, remember that standing up can make a difference. You might not change everything overnight, but your courage can inspire others, build new connections, and bring about real change. And who knows? Maybe a little garden gnome is all it takes to get the ball rolling. As the seasons changed, so did our neighborhood. What had started as a battle over a single garden gnome blossomed into a renewed sense of community that many of us hadn't realized we were missing. Neighbors who once kept to themselves were now stopping by for casual chats over fences or sharing tools and plants. Kids played freely between yards without the usual watchful eyes of HOA enforcers waiting to catch violations. It was almost like a small revolution had quietly taken place. No banners, no marches, just everyday acts of kindness and openness replacing suspicion and control. I remember one particular afternoon when I saw Mrs. Patel, who had been known for her immaculate but very plain yard, putting up a colorful wind chime by her porch. I paused and asked if she was redecorating. She smiled and said, "I always wanted to, but I was afraid of the HOA rules. Now, I feel free." Her words stuck with me. Freedom to express yourself in your own home. That's something many of us take for granted, but in our neighborhood, it had been a big deal. This shift wasn't just about decorations or gnomes. It changed how people interacted, how we felt about where we lived. People started organizing block parties, potlucks, and movie nights on the lawn. There was a growing feeling that this place was ours, not just a collection of houses, but a real neighborhood. Through all of this, I learned that standing up to unfair rules isn't just about fighting back. It's about creating space for everyone to thrive. It's about pushing back against control that doesn't serve the people it's supposed to protect. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. There were days I doubted whether all this effort was worth it. The stress of dealing with the HOA, the fear of retaliation, and the occasional harsh words from Karen supporters made me question if I should just give in. But every time I felt that way, I reminded myself why I started. It wasn't just about a garden gnome or a $500 fine. It was about fairness, respect, and community. I wasn't alone either. Neighbors reached out, sharing their own stories and standing with me. We became a little team, supporting each other through emails, meetings, and conversations. That sense of unity gave me strength. Eventually, I decided to run for a position on the HOA board. I wanted to help make sure the new rules stayed fair and that the board listened to the people it served. It was nerve-wracking putting myself out there, but it felt right. When I won, it wasn't about power or control, it was about responsibility. I wanted to be a voice for fairness and openness, to make sure no one else would have to go through what I did. Being on the board gave me a new perspective. I saw the challenges of balancing individual freedoms with community needs. It's not always simple, and mistakes happen. But the difference now was transparency and dialogue. We started regular community forums where anyone could ask questions or suggest changes. We held workshops on understanding HOA rules, explaining them clearly so people wouldn't feel lost or intimidated. The garden gnome? It became a neighborhood mascot. We even made little replicas to give out at events, fun reminders that sometimes the smallest things can stand up to the biggest problems. Reflecting on the whole experience, I realized how important it is to know your rights and to speak up. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of rules and authority, but understanding those rules and standing together makes a difference. More than that, I saw how important community is. It's not just the houses or the lawns, it's the people. The friendships, the shared moments, the support we give each other. So if you're watching this and dealing with a tough HOA or a difficult neighbor, remember the story. Remember the gnome that started it all. You don't have to accept unfairness. You can stand up, gather your neighbors, and work toward change. It might be hard, it might be slow, but it's possible. Because in the end, a community is what we make of it. And sometimes, it takes just one small act of courage to change everything. As the years passed, the story of the garden gnome and the HOA showdown became something of a legend in our neighborhood. Not just because of the gnome itself, but because of what it represented. The moment when everyday people decided they had enough of being pushed around by vague rules and overzealous authority. People who had once been strangers became friends. The change was subtle but profound. Our streets filled with laughter and conversation instead of silence and suspicion. Families who had hesitated to decorate their homes now did so with pride. Porches were painted in bright colors. Flower beds blossomed with wildflowers and native plants, and garden gnomes, yes, lots more gnomes, sprang up like cheerful little sentinels. That victory over the unfair $500 fine wasn't just about a decoration. It became a symbol of standing up to unfairness and taking back a sense of control over our own homes and lives. When I think about that time, I realize how much I grew as a person too. Before all this, I never imagined I'd get involved in community politics or be an advocate for homeowners' rights. I just wanted to live peacefully, enjoy my yard, and maybe put out a cute garden statue. But standing up to the HOA showed me that sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in. It taught me that rules aren't just words on paper, they affect real people's lives. And that when those rules are applied unfairly, it can harm the very community they're supposed to protect. Being on the HOA board later gave me a whole new perspective. I saw the hard work it takes to balance everyone's needs. It's not easy to make decisions that please everyone. But the key is listening, being transparent, and remembering that the community comes first. We worked hard to create a culture where people felt heard and respected. Our meetings became forums for honest conversation, where neighbors could bring up concerns and ideas without fear of being dismissed or bullied. I started mentoring others in the neighborhood, encouraging more homeowners to get involved. It felt good to pass on the lessons I'd learned. Know your rights, stand your ground respectfully, and never underestimate the power of community. The gnome stayed in my garden all this time, of course. Sometimes I'd catch kids sneaking little hats or toys onto it, or neighbors leaving funny notes nearby. It became more than a decoration. It was a beacon of neighborhood spirit. Looking back, the whole ordeal reminds me how important it is to be engaged in your community. Whether it's an HOA, a neighborhood watch, or a block association, getting involved helps shape the place where you live. If you're watching this and facing unfair rules or difficult people in your neighborhood, know that you're not alone. It might feel intimidating, but change is possible. Start small. Talk to your neighbors. Learn the rules. And don't be afraid to speak up. Because sometimes it's the smallest things, a garden gnome, a conversation, a shared meal, that start the biggest changes. And sometimes those changes don't just improve your neighborhood. They change you. So here's to the little gnome who wouldn't back down. To the neighbors who found their voices. And to all of us who believe that community is about respect, fairness, and standing together. The end? Maybe not. Because every day, in neighborhoods across the world, people are standing up for their homes and their rights, one small victory at a time. And if that story can inspire even one person to stand up and make a difference, then the gnome's work is far from over.